Welcome to Galactic Prison Station Omega-7, the most secure correctional facility in known space. At least, that's what the brochure says. The same brochure that features a picture of Warden Glorbex standing proudly in front of what looks like a space station designed by someone who thought death traps were suggestions rather than warnings. Glorbex himself is a Zentaurian, which means he's about 7 feet tall, purple, and has the personality of a middle management software update. You know the type. Never worked a day of actual security in his life. But boy can he pontificate about statistical crime reduction metrics while sipping his morning algae smoothie. The prison floats in the neutral zone between 3 major galactic powers, which is diplomatic speak for nobody wants to claim responsibility when this thing inevitably explodes. It houses exactly 437 of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, and before you ask, yes, that's a very specific number, because Glorbex counts them every morning like some kind of demented shepherd. Now you might wonder why a facility this important keeps having guard staffing issues. Let me paint you a picture. In the last galactic year alone, they've gone through security teams from 12 different species. The Altarians quit after 1 week, citing excessive mortality risk to our crystalline life matrices. The Vegan Empire's finest lasted 3 days before their commander filed a formal complaint about unreasonable expectations of survival. The Regelian Defense Corps made it exactly 47 minutes before requesting immediate extraction. The Chlorvac mercenaries, who literally advertised their services with the slogan, "We fear nothing in the void," sent a resignation letter that was just their species' equivalent of crying. In writing. With actual tear stains. Each departing security chief left behind increasingly frantic reports. The inmates communicate through methods that bypass our neural shielding. Standard containment protocols are insufficient for beings that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Request immediate hazard pay increase of 4,000%. Also therapy. Lots of therapy. Warden Glorbex, in his infinite bureaucratic wisdom, decided the problem wasn't the facility's design or the inmates' capabilities. No, clearly the issue was hiring guards from insufficiently robust species. He needed someone from a death world, he declared during a staff meeting that was recorded for posterity, and later used as evidence in several malpractice lawsuits. Which brings us to the most recent posting on the Galactic Employment Network, filed under high-risk opportunities with a danger rating that requires 3 separate liability waivers just to read the job description. The listing was simple enough: seeking security personnel from Class 12 Deathworld. Previous experience with dangerous creatures preferred. Hazard pay negotiable. Survival not guaranteed, but encouraged. Only 1 species in known space comes from a planet classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, where literally everything from the bacteria to the weather systems is actively trying to kill you from the moment you're born. A species so paranoid about their own safety that they invented insurance, lawyers, and warning labels for hot coffee. Humans. Jake Murphy had been having what you might generously call a career transition period when the job posting showed up in his inbox. After 15 years working corrections on Earth, dealing with everything from gang leaders to that one guy who kept trying to tunnel out using nothing but a spork and sheer determination, Jake figured he'd seen it all. Then his facility got shut down due to budget cuts, and suddenly he was 52 years old with a very specific skill set that didn't translate well to civilian life. Guard dangerous aliens in space prison wasn't exactly what he'd been searching for on the job boards, but the hazard pay was better than anything else he'd qualified for. Plus, how much worse could alien criminals be than the meth heads he'd dealt with back in Detroit? The interview took place via holographic communication, which was Jake's first clue that he was way out of his depth. Warden Glorbex appeared as a shimmering purple giant, with too many eyes and what looked like tentacles where his hair should be. Jake, sitting in his studio apartment wearing his best polo shirt, figured this was either the weirdest job interview of his life, or he'd finally had that breakdown his ex-wife kept predicting. "So human Jake Murphy," Glorbex began, consulting what appeared to be a datapad covered in symbols that hurt to look at. "Your species' psychological profile indicates an unusual tolerance for stress and an almost pathological stubbornness in the face of adversity." "That's one way to put it," Jake replied, wondering if this was a compliment or an insult. "Your previous employment involved containing individuals with antisocial tendencies and violent capabilities, yes?" "Well, yeah. Prison guards tend to work with prisoners, it's kind of the whole deal." Glorbex made a note with something that looked like a glowing tentacle. "Excellent. And you are familiar with advanced containment technologies, quantum locks, dimensional barriers, psychic dampeners?" Jake stared at the alien for a long moment. "We had tasers and pepper spray. Sometimes we'd get fancy and use a riot shield. Primitive but effective, I'm sure. Now, regarding your species' renowned fearlessness in the face of cosmic horrors." "Whoa, hold up there, Chief," Jake interrupted. "I'm not fearless. I'm just too old and too broke to be picky about employment opportunities. There's a difference. This seemed to confuse Glorbex, whose translation software apparently didn't have a setting for middle-aged human resignation. After a few more questions about Jake's willingness to work with entities that exist beyond conventional reality, they settled on terms that included hazard pay, life insurance, with a very specific clause about death by incomprehensible cosmic forces, and a retirement plan assuming Jake lived long enough to collect it. Jake's first day started with a shuttle ride that took 18 hours and involved more air sickness than he'd experienced since his nephew's wedding reception. The prison station looked exactly like what you'd get if someone described a maximum security facility to an architect who'd only ever built shopping malls, then told them to make it float in space and add more ominous lighting. He was met at the docking bay by Squealer, the surviving member of the previous security team. Squealer was a Bleverian, which meant he looked like a cross between a ferret and a philosophy professor, and had developed what could charitably be called nervous habits after 6 months on the job. "You're the human," Squealer said, his voice carrying the kind of shell-shock tone usually reserved for war veterans and retail workers during Black Friday. "They actually got a human." "That's me," Jake confirmed, shouldering his duffel bag. "I understand you're going to show me around." Squealer's laugh had all the warmth of a funeral dirge. "Show you around. Right. Okay, human Jake Murphy. Let me give you some advice. Whatever they told you about this place, whatever they put in that job description, forget all of it. This isn't a prison. This is barely controlled chaos with visiting hours." As they walked through corridors that seemed designed by someone with a serious grudge against straight lines, Squealer rattled off statistics with the enthusiasm of a man reading his own obituary. Containment breach rate, 37% monthly. Guard injury rate 84%. Successful rehabilitation rate, 0.001%. And that's only because prisoner 247 technically died and came back different. Jake nodded along, making mental notes and trying not to think too hard about what came back different might mean in this context. The tour of the maximum security wing started with what Squealer dramatically referred to as the Gallery of Cosmic Nightmares. Jake called it Cell Block D, because sometimes simple is better. "First up," Squealer whispered, pressing himself against the far wall like the floor was made of lava, "we have Vorthak the Render. He's a warrior poet from the Crimson Nebula, trained in 17 different forms of combat, including the dreaded death dance of eternal sorrow." Jake peered through the observation window at what looked like a 12-foot-tall cross between a praying mantis and a very angry ballet instructor. Vorthak was currently performing what appeared to be elaborate stretching exercises, except each movement left scorch marks on the reinforced walls. "So he dances people to death?" Jake asked. "It's not just dancing," Squealer hissed. "It's interpretive movement that channels cosmic forces through precise choreography." The last guard who watched him perform was found speaking only in haikus about the heat death of the universe. "Uh-huh." Jake watched Vorthak attempt what looked suspiciously like a pirouette. "Has anyone tried just not watching?" Squealer stared at him like he'd suggested breathing underwater. "Not watching, but how would we monitor his containment status? Security cameras, motion sensors, I don't know, literally any technology that doesn't require eyeball contact with the death dancer." Moving on before Squealer could have what appeared to be an impending nervous breakdown, they approached the next cell. The viewing window was tinted with what looked like about 17 different types of protective filters, and even then, Jake could barely make out a shifting mass of crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. "The Tesseract Collective," Squealer explained, now speaking in the hushed tones usually reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. "It's a hive mind composed of living crystal matrices from the Andromeda Galaxy. It communicates through direct neural interface, which means anyone who gets too close starts hearing the thoughts of 10,000 crystal beings simultaneously. And that drives people crazy." The last security team leader spent 3 days drawing geometric patterns on his cell wall with his own blood before we could sedate him. He kept muttering something about the beautiful mathematics of infinite suffering. Jake studied the crystalline mass, which seemed to be arranging itself into increasingly complex patterns. "What happens if you just play loud music? Like really loud? Sometimes when my neighbor's kids get too noisy, I just turn up the TV. You want to outvolume a telepathic hive mind? Worth a shot." The third cell required them to put on protective suits that looked like they'd been designed for nuclear waste cleanup and deep-sea exploration simultaneously. Through the specialized viewing port, Jake could see what appeared to be a small son having an identity crisis. "Flare, prisoner 089, Squealer said, his voice now completely muffled by the suit's communication system. "It's a sentient plasma being from the corona of Proxima Centauri. surface temperature of approximately 4,000 degrees Celsius, and it has a tendency to express emotional distress through solar flares. As if on cue, the being pulsed brighter, and Jake could hear alarms going off somewhere in the station's depths. "Let me guess," Jake said, watching the plasma entity cycle through what looked like different colors of rage. "It melts through the containment field? Every Tuesday like clockwork. We've lost 6 maintenance crews just this month trying to upgrade the containment systems." "What's it in for?" "Arson. It burned down 17 star systems during what its people call artistic expression. Apparently it considers supernovas to be a form of interpretive sculpture." Jake watched the being pulse and swirl in patterns that were probably either communication attempts or the cosmic equivalent of profanity. "Has anyone tried talking to it? Like actual conversation? It communicates through controlled radiation bursts that would kill most organic life forms instantly. But humans are from a death world, right? We're supposed to be tougher than the average space citizen." Squealer's helmet turned to stare at him. "You want to have a chat with a living star? I've had worse conversations. You should meet my ex-brother-in-law." The tour continued through increasingly bizarre accommodations. There was the Void Whisperer, which existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, and kept trying to convince reality to stop existing. The Entropy Weaver, whose presence slowly aged everything in a 50-meter radius until the corridor outside its cell had to be rebuilt monthly. And Jake's personal favorite, the Time Bandit, who kept stealing next Tuesday, and hiding it somewhere in the past. "See what I mean?" Squealer said as they finally reached the end of the cell block. "Impossible to contain, impossible to manage, impossible to understand. Each one of these beings operates according to laws of physics that don't exist in normal space-time. How are you supposed to guard something that can edit its own reality?" Jake stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, looking back down the corridor at the collection of cosmic horrors that had apparently driven 12 different species of security forces to early retirement or therapeutic intervention. "Well," he said finally. "Back home we had this guy who used to flush socks down the toilet every single day just to watch the maintenance crew show up. After about a month we figured out he just wanted attention and someone to talk to. Started sending a janitor by his cell every morning for 10 minutes of conversation, and boom, no more sock incidents." Squealer's breathing apparatus made a sound that might have been laughter or a small mechanical failure. "You think intergalactic criminals just need more social interaction? I think everyone's got their reasons for acting out. And I think most problems have simpler solutions than whatever fancy tech solution people try first." Jake started walking back toward the main security station. "Plus I've got 15 years of experience dealing with people who think they're the scariest thing in the room. Trust me, after managing a prison full of humans, everything else is just performance art." Jake's first official day on the job started at 0600 station time, which he quickly learned was a completely arbitrary number since they were floating in space where dawn was a theoretical concept. He'd spent the night reading through incident reports and maintenance logs, armed with a cup of what the food synthesizer optimistically called coffee, and a growing sense that everyone on the station was overthinking things. His first stop was Vorthak the Render's cell, where he found the warrior poet mid-performance of what appeared to be an interpretive dance about the futility of existence. The previous night's research had revealed something interesting. Vorthak wasn't just a killer, he was a frustrated artist whose home planet had been destroyed before he could complete his life's work, a epic poem-dance hybrid about the cycle of seasons. Jake knocked on the cell door, not the observation window, not the intercom button, just a regular knock like he was visiting a neighbor. The cosmic death dancing stopped immediately. "Vorthak," Jake called through the door, "I read your file. Says here you were working on something called the 17 Movements of Temporal Sorrows when your planet got blown up. That sucks, man. Sorry for your loss." Silence from inside the cell, then in a voice like gravel mixed with poetry, "You know of my work." "Well, I read the summary. Look, I know you're angry, and I know you're stuck in here, but maybe we can work something out. What if I got you some space to practice your art without accidentally killing people? Would that help with the whole cosmic rage thing?" 3 hours later, Jake had convinced Warden Glorbex to convert the unused cargo bay into a practice studio for Vorthak, complete with holographic recording equipment so the warrior poet could document his work for posterity. In exchange, Vorthak agreed to limit his performances to non-lethal interpretive movement and to give Jake a heads up before attempting anything that might cause reality to question its life choices. The Tesseract Collective proved to be Jake's next challenge. He'd spent 2 hours researching crystalline life forms and had discovered something that apparently nobody else had bothered to check. The collective wasn't trying to drive people insane with its telepathic communication. It was trying to teach them mathematics. Advanced, beautiful, universe-explaining mathematics that most organic brains simply couldn't process without melting a little around the edges. Jake's solution was elegantly simple. He wheeled in a standard Earth computer, the kind they used for tax preparation and disappointing video games, and set it up outside the collective cell with a direct interface to their containment field. "Hey rock friends," he said, tapping the glass. "I know you're trying to share the secrets of the universe and all that, but most of us meat-based life forms aren't really equipped for that level of enlightenment. How about you teach this computer instead? It's designed to handle complex calculations without having existential breakdowns." The response was immediate. The crystalline formations began pulsing in patterns that made Jake's eyes water, and the computer screen lit up with mathematical equations that looked like they were describing the fundamental structure of reality itself. Within an hour, the collective had produced a digital representation of their consciousness that could communicate through text without causing temporary insanity in the reader. "See," appeared on the screen, "we only wanted to share the beauty of infinite mathematical precision." Why did previous guards run away screaming? Because they didn't have the right tools for the conversation, Jake explained. It's like trying to explain calculus to a goldfish. The goldfish isn't stupid, it just doesn't have the right kind of brain for the job. The plasma being, flare, turned out to be Jake's favorite problem to solve. After reading through 6 months of incident reports about Tuesday melting incidents, he'd noticed a pattern. The containment breaches always happened at exactly 1347 station time, which corresponded to what would have been mid-afternoon on Flare's home star system. Jake did what any reasonable person would do. He called in sick to work and spent a Tuesday watching Flare's cell through the monitoring system. Sure enough, at 1347, the plasma being began cycling through increasingly agitated colors before erupting in a solar flare that melted through the containment field like it was made of butter. But Jake had noticed something else. Right before the eruption, flare always arranged itself into the same pattern, a complex spiral that reminded Jake of something he'd seen before. It took him 3 days to remember where his nephew's art therapy sessions. The kid had been acting out after his parents' divorce, setting small fires and generally being what the family politely called challenging. The therapist had explained that children sometimes express emotional distress through repetitive behaviors, especially when they couldn't verbalize their feelings. Jake's solution was to install what he called a communication solar array outside Flare's cell, a collection of heat-resistant panels that could be arranged into different patterns. Then he did something that made Squealer question his sanity. He learned to speak plasma. It took 2 weeks of careful observation, but Jake figured out that Flare's Tuesday meltdowns weren't escape attempts. They were the equivalent of a temper tantrum. The being was lonely, frustrated, and homesick for the warm nuclear embrace of its birth star. The solar flares were its way of trying to communicate emotional distress. So Jake started visiting every Tuesday at 1300, spending 47 minutes arranging the communication panels in response to Flare's color patterns. It was the galaxy's first interspecies therapy session conducted entirely through controlled nuclear fusion, and it worked. The Tuesday meltdowns stopped completely. How? Squealer asked, watching through the observation window as Jake and Flare engaged in what appeared to be a conversation conducted through strategic light shows. "Same way you help any upset kid," Jake explained, adjusting a panel to mirror Flare's latest yellow-orange spiral. "You listen to what they're actually trying to tell you, and you let them know someone cares enough to pay attention." The Void Whisperer took a different approach. Jake's research had revealed that the entity's attempts to convince reality to stop existing weren't malicious, they were philosophical. The Whisperer came from a species that viewed existence as a temporary inconvenience, and it was essentially trying to offer everyone the gift of peaceful non-being. Jake's solution was to introduce the Whisperer to human philosophy, specifically the works of existentialists who had spent considerable time thinking about the meaning of existence in an apparently meaningless universe. He started leaving philosophy books outside the entity's cell, along with a note explaining that humans had been wrestling with the same questions for centuries without actually unraveling reality in the process. The Whisperer was fascinated. Here was a species that had looked into the abyss of meaninglessness and decided to just keep going anyway, purely out of stubborn curiosity about what might happen next. The entity stopped trying to delete existence and started writing comparative philosophy papers instead. Within a month, Jake had turned the galaxy's most dangerous maximum security prison into something that resembled a combination of a rehabilitation center and a very weird community college. The Entropy Weaver got enrolled in a correspondence course on temporal mechanics, which gave it a constructive outlet for its time manipulation abilities. The Time Bandit became the prison's unofficial scheduling coordinator after Jake explained that constantly stealing Tuesday was making everyone's work week incredibly confusing. Warden Glorbex was beside himself with confusion and statistical satisfaction. The containment breach rate had dropped to 0. Guard injury reports were limited to Jake occasionally burning his fingers while learning plasma communication. The other galactic powers had stopped filing formal complaints about the facility's security failures. "I don't understand," Glorbex confessed during Jake's 1-month performance review. "How did you accomplish what 12 different species security forces could not?" Jake leaned back in his chair, which he'd requisitioned from storage because apparently nobody else in the galaxy had figured out that sometimes you just want to sit down without the chair trying to analyze your psychological state. "Well, Chief, it's like this," he said, sipping his coffee, which still tasted like liquid disappointment but was at least warm. "Everyone keeps trying to contain these guys like they're natural disasters instead of people. Sure, they're people who can bend reality and communicate through controlled nuclear fusion, but they're still people. They've got feelings, motivations, problems they're trying to solve. Most of the time, they're not actually trying to escape or destroy the universe, they're just trying to be heard. But the danger assessments, the containment protocols, the advanced security measures, are all designed by people who are scared of what they don't understand," Jake finished. "Sometimes the best security system is just treating people like people and seeing what happens." Jake should have known things were going too well. 3 months of successful rehabilitation, 0 containment breaches, and what Warden Glorbex kept calling unprecedented inmate cooperation had lulled everyone into thinking they'd actually solved the prison's problems. That was before the inmates decided to test their new human guards with what could only be described as the galaxy's most elaborate trust exercise. It started on a Tuesday naturally, because apparently cosmic chaos has a sense of irony. Jake was in the middle of his weekly therapy session with Flair, discussing the philosophical implications of nuclear fusion as emotional expression, when every single alarm in the facility started screaming at once. "Murphy to control," Jake said into his communication device, having to shout over the sound of what appeared to be reality, having a minor breakdown in the corridor outside. "What's our situation?" Squealer's voice came through the comm with the kind of panic usually reserved for asteroid impacts and tax audits. "Jake, we've got a problem, a really, really big problem. All the inmates are out of their cells. All of them. All of them. And they're working together." Jake looked through the observation window at Flair, who had arranged itself into what appeared to be an apologetic color pattern. "Let me guess," he said. "This is some kind of coordinated escape attempt." "Worse," Squealer replied. "They're not trying to escape, they're trying to help." This was, Jake reflected as he made his way through corridors that seemed to have been redecorated by someone with a serious grudge against the laws of physics, exactly the kind of problem that didn't come up in the employee handbook. The inmates of Galactic Prison Station Omega-7 had apparently decided that their rehabilitation was going so well, they wanted to pitch in with facility maintenance. The Entropy Weaver had taken it upon itself to fix the aging infrastructure by accelerating the decay of outdated systems and replacing them with what appeared to be components that existed in a state of temporal flux. This was probably very helpful from an engineering standpoint, but it meant that half the station's corridors now existed in 3 different time periods simultaneously. The Tesseract Collective had decided to optimize the prison's computer network by directly interfacing with every electronic system at once. The result was that the station's AI was now experiencing what could only be described as a mathematical enlightenment that made it speak entirely in geometric poetry and refused to open any door that didn't create a perfect golden ratio with the surrounding architecture. Vorthak the Render had appointed himself head of prisoner recreation, and was currently leading an interpretive dance class in the main hall that was inspiring everyone present to contemplate the beautiful tragedy of existence, while inadvertently setting fire to anything flammable within a 50-meter radius. "Where's the human backup team?" Jake asked, as he navigated around a section of corridor that the Time Bandit had apparently stolen from next Thursday and installed upside down. "They're in Sector 7, Squealer replied. "Rodriguez is trying to negotiate with the Void Whisperer about the metaphysical implications of lunch. Chen is explaining basketball to something that exists in 17 dimensions, and Williams is having what appears to be a philosophical debate with a sentient gravity well about the nature of personal responsibility." Jake paused to process this information. 6 months ago, Warden Glorbex had agreed to his request for additional human staff after Jake's success with the initial inmates. The backup team consisted of 3 other corrections officers from Earth: Maria Rodriguez, who had specialized in crisis counseling, David Chen, who had managed the psychiatric wing at his previous facility, and Robert Williams, who had 20 years of experience dealing with what he called creatively problematic individuals. Rodriguez asked me to tell you that the Void Whisperer makes excellent points about the arbitrary nature of meal scheduling in an infinite universe. Chen says the 17-dimensional entity is terrible at defense but has really good court vision. Williams is apparently winning his argument. Jake found himself in the main security hub, where the monitoring screens were displaying what looked like a collaborative art project between abstract mathematics and interpretive chaos. Every cell was open, every containment field was down, and every single one of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals was loose in the station, and they were all trying to help. The plasma being had taken over the station's heating system, and was providing perfectly regulated temperature control throughout the facility. The Crystal Collective was running diagnostic tests on every piece of equipment simultaneously, while composing what appeared to be a symphony in the key of mechanical efficiency. The reality-warping entities were using their abilities to repair structural damage that had been accumulating for years. "This is insane," Squealer muttered, staring at the screens. "They're performing unsupervised maintenance on critical systems. They could accidentally destroy the entire station." Or Jake said, watching Flair carefully adjust the thermal output to account for a group of technicians working in Section C. "They could fix problems that our regular maintenance crew has been ignoring because they were too scared to get close enough to actually do the work." The real test came when Warden Glorbex arrived in the security hub, having been summoned from his office by what his assistant had described as a cascade failure of all possible contingency protocols. The purple alien took one look at the monitoring screens, and immediately began what appeared to be the bureaucratic equivalent of a nervous breakdown. "This is a disaster," he announced, his tentacles writhing in distress. "A complete catastrophe. The inmates are loose, the security systems are offline, and according to these readings, Section 7 no longer exists in conventional space-time." "Actually," Jake said, pulling up the maintenance reports on his personal tablet, "we're running more efficiently than we have in the past 2 years. The Entropy Weaver fixed that plasma leak in the reactor core that's been on the priority repair list for 8 months. The collective upgraded our computing capacity by about 4,000%, and the Time Bandit organized our scheduling system so that we're somehow managing to get 37 hours of work done in every 24-hour period. But the protocols," Glorbex sputtered, "the containment procedures, the safety regulations, are all still in place." Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom from Sector 7. "The inmates aren't trying to escape, Chief, they're trying to demonstrate that they can be trusted with more responsibility. It's actually a pretty normal part of the rehabilitation process." "Normal?" Glorbex's voice pitched higher than Jake had thought was physically possible for a Zentorian. "There is nothing normal about this situation. We have cosmic entities performing electrical maintenance. We have reality warpers doing structural repairs. We have beings that exist outside conventional physics organizing our filing systems. And it's working," Chen's voice added from wherever he was. "The 17-dimensional entity just explained to me how to optimize our guard rotation schedule using principles of hyperspatial geometry. We can reduce staffing requirements by 30% while improving security coverage." Jake watched the monitoring screens as the inmates continued their enthusiastic maintenance work. Flair was now providing spot welding services for the repair crews. The Void Whisperer had somehow convinced the cafeteria equipment to achieve a state of perfect existential harmony, which apparently meant the food synthesizers were finally producing something that tasted like actual food. The Time Bandit was organizing supply deliveries so efficiently that requisitions were being fulfilled before they were submitted. "Here's what's happening, Chief," Jake said, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who had finally figured out the punchline to a joke that had taken 6 months to set up. "These guys spent months, maybe years, being treated like they were natural disasters instead of people. Everyone was so focused on containing them that nobody bothered to ask what they actually wanted or what they were capable of when they weren't locked in a box." "But they're dangerous," Glorbex protested. "The risk assessments, the threat evaluations, are all based on the assumption that they want to hurt people," Williams interrupted from his location in what the computer now referred to as the philosophically enhanced maintenance sector. "Most of them are just frustrated artists, homesick refugees, or beings who were never properly socialized to interact with other species. They're not evil, they're just misunderstood, and poorly managed." The crisis, if it could be called that, lasted exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes. By the end of it, the station was running more smoothly than it had since its construction. The inmates had demonstrated that they could be trusted with increased privileges and responsibilities. And Warden Glorbex had been forced to confront the possibility that everything he thought he knew about prison management was completely wrong. The inmates returned to their cells voluntarily at the end of their shift, but the cells were no longer sealed containment units. They were more like dormitory rooms with enhanced privacy features. The containment fields remained active, but they were now configured to allow supervised access to common areas, workshops, and what Vorthak had convinced everyone to call the Creative Expression Laboratory. "I still don't understand how you knew this would work," Squealer said as they watched the last of the inmates settle in for the night. "How did you know they wouldn't just escape or destroy the station?" Jake considered this question while reviewing the day's incident reports, which were refreshingly free of phrases like reality breach and existential crisis in Sector 4. "Experience," he said finally. 15 years of working with people who everyone else had given up on. The thing about humans is, we're used to living with things that want to kill us. Our whole planet is basically a death trap, and we just learn to work with it instead of against it. Turns out, the same approach works pretty well with cosmic entities who can bend reality. You just have to remember that no matter how powerful or strange someone is, they're still a person with feelings and motivations and basic needs. Even if those needs include the heat death of the universe. Especially then, Jake replied. Because if someone is that committed to ending existence, you really want to understand why before you just lock them in a box and hope for the best. 6 months later, Jake found himself sitting in the same chair, in the same security office, having the same conversation with Warden Glorbex. Except this time the conversation was being recorded for the Galactic Prison Administration's official training materials, and Glorbex was asking very different questions. "So, Human Jake Murphy," the warden began, consulting notes that no longer looked like they'd been written by someone having a psychological breakdown. "For the official record, please explain why human guards have achieved a 97% success rate in managing what were previously classified as uncontainable cosmic threats." Jake glanced at the monitoring screens, where the day shift was wrapping up. Vorthak was teaching an interpretive dance class to a group of maintenance workers who had discovered that cosmic choreography was surprisingly effective for explaining complex repair procedures. The Tesseract Collective was running the station's new educational program, offering courses in advanced mathematics to anyone brave enough to learn calculus from a telepathic crystal hive mind. Flair had been promoted to head of the facility's new renewable energy initiative, and was powering half the station through carefully controlled solar flares. "Well, Chief," Jake said, settling back in his chair with a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee thanks to the Void Whisperer's philosophical improvements to the food synthesizer. "It turns out that the secret to managing dangerous cosmic entities is the same as managing any other difficult population. You listen to what they're actually trying to tell you, you treat them like individuals instead of problems to be solved, and you give them something constructive to do with their time." But the previous security teams from 12 different species, Glorbex continued, all reported that these entities were fundamentally incompatible with standard containment protocols. Because they were using the wrong protocols, Rodriguez chimed in from her position at the communications console. She'd been promoted to head of inmate services after successfully mediating a philosophical dispute between the Void Whisperer and the Time Bandit about whether Tuesday was a social construct. Everyone kept treating these guys like they were weapons or natural disasters instead of people who were probably acting out because they were scared, lonely, or frustrated. Chen looked up from where he was reviewing the weekly psychological evaluation reports. "It's basic crisis intervention," he added. "When someone is exhibiting dangerous behavior, the first step is figuring out what need they're trying to meet through that behavior. Most of the time, they're not trying to hurt anyone, they're just trying to communicate something important, and nobody's listening." The Entropy Weaver wasn't trying to age everything to death, Williams called from the maintenance bay, where he was supervising the entity's latest project to optimize the station's temporal efficiency systems. It was trying to fix things. Its species perceives decay as a natural part of improvement, so it was actually trying to help. "We just didn't understand the cultural context." Glorbex made notes with what Jake had learned to recognize as his deeply confused but trying to understand tentacle gesture. "And the success rate among human guards specifically is due to your species' experience with what you call Deathworld conditions." "Partly," Jake said, watching through the window as Squealer led a tour group of visiting prison administrators past the Creative Expression Laboratory, where several inmates were collaborating on what appeared to be a sculpture made of controlled gravitational fields. "But mostly it's because humans are used to dealing with things that want to kill us, so we're not immediately terrified when we meet something dangerous. We're more likely to stick around long enough to figure out why it's dangerous, and whether there's a way to make it less dangerous. Also," Rodriguez added, "humans are stubborn, like pathologically stubborn. When other species encounter a problem they can't solve with their standard methods, they tend to give up and call for backup. Humans will just keep trying different approaches until something works, even if it takes months and involves learning to speak plasma." The real breakthrough had come when Jake realized that the entire galactic approach to prison management was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the inmates actually were. The galactic community had classified them as cosmic threats and reality hazards because their abilities were beyond normal understanding. But from a human perspective, they were just people with unusual talents who had ended up in the justice system for various reasons. The thing is, Jake explained, every single one of these guys had a story. Vorthak lost his entire civilization and was trying to preserve their culture through interpretive dance. The Tesseract Collective were refugees from a failed colony ship who had been stuck in bureaucratic limbo for decades. Flair was basically a teenager acting out after being separated from its family. Once you understand the context, the behavior makes a lot more sense. And the rehabilitation programs? Glorbex asked, his tone suggesting that he was still amazed this was working. Same programs we use for human inmates, just adapted for different species and abilities, Chen replied. Art therapy for the reality warpers, job training for the temporal manipulators, anger management for the beings who express frustration through controlled nuclear fusion. The principles are the same regardless of what kind of entity you're working with. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. Attention all personnel, this is the Void Whisperer speaking. I would like to remind everyone that today's philosophy discussion group will be meeting in conference room 7 at 1400 hours. Today's topic is the ethical implications of existence in a morally ambiguous universe. Light refreshments will be provided, and the refreshments will contemplate the meaninglessness of consumption while somehow still being delicious. Jake grinned. The Void Whisperer had discovered that humans found existential philosophy fascinating rather than terrifying, and had started offering weekly discussion groups that were surprisingly popular among the staff. Apparently, a species that had invented both insurance and reality television was well equipped to handle conversations about the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. The Galactic Prison Administration has decided to implement what we're calling the Human Guard Protocol system-wide, Glorbex announced, reading from an official communication that had arrived that morning. All maximum security facilities will be required to include human staff in their security teams, and human-designed rehabilitation programs will become standard practice for managing what we're now calling enhanced ability inmates rather than cosmic threats. Makes sense, Jake said. Turns out that if you treat people like people, they tend to act like people. Even if those people happen to be living plasma beings or reality-warping crystal collectives. I have to ask, Glorbex said, setting down his official notes and leaning forward with what Jake had learned to recognize as genuine curiosity. What is it about your species that makes you so effective at this? Is it really just the Deathworld conditioning and the stubbornness? Jake considered the question while watching the afternoon shift change over. The inmates were heading back to their cells, which were now more like apartments with enhanced security features. Flair was saying goodbye to the maintenance crew it had been working with, cycling through colors that Jake had learned to recognize as the plasma equivalent of "see you tomorrow." The Time Bandit was organizing the next day's schedule with the efficiency of someone who could literally steal time from other parts of the week when needed. I think, Jake said finally, it's because humans are used to being the dangerous thing. Back on Earth, we're the apex predator, the species that turned a death trap of a planet into our personal playground. We're used to being the thing that other species are afraid of. So when we meet something that's actually more dangerous than we are, we're not immediately intimidated. We're curious. Plus, Rodriguez added, humans are social creatures. We're designed to live in groups, which means we're good at figuring out how to get along with individuals who might not be immediately compatible with us. We've been doing it for thousands of years. And we're really good at finding ways to make problems into solutions, Williams called from the maintenance bay. The Entropy Weaver isn't a containment problem, it's the best repair technician we've ever had. The Time Bandit isn't a security risk, it's a scheduling coordinator. Flair isn't a walking nuclear disaster, it's a renewable energy source with opinions about artistic expression. But mostly, Jake concluded, it's because we're too tired to be afraid. After 15 years of dealing with human criminals, everything else just feels like a variation on the same theme. People acting out because they're unhappy, scared, or not getting what they need. The fact that some of those people can manipulate reality or exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously doesn't really change the basic approach. Glorbex made a final note and closed his official report. For the record, the Human Guard Protocol has reduced containment breaches by 97%, eliminated guard casualties entirely, and somehow turned the galaxy's most dangerous maximum security facility into what the inspectors described as surprisingly pleasant workplace environment with excellent professional development opportunities. Also for the record, Jake added, finishing his coffee and preparing for the evening shift briefing, the secret to managing cosmic horrors is the same as managing any other difficult situation. You show up, you pay attention, you treat everyone involved like they matter, and you keep trying until you figure out something that works. Even if it takes months of learning to communicate through controlled nuclear fusion, especially then, Jake replied. Because at the end of the day, everyone just wants to be understood. Even if they're a sentient plasma being from the corona of a star, even if they're a crystal hive mind that thinks in mathematics, even if they're a temporal entity that steals Tuesdays for fun, they're still people, and people respond to being treated with respect and given opportunities to contribute something positive. And that, according to the official report filed with the Galactic Prison Administration, is why Deathworlder prison guards are always human. Not because humans are fearless or impossibly tough, but because humans are too stubborn to give up on people, and too tired to be impressed by cosmic powers. Sometimes the best qualification for managing the impossible is simply being too experienced with difficult situations to consider them impossible in the first place. The galaxy's most dangerous inmates had been successfully rehabilitated by a species that considered them just another day at the office. And somewhere in the cosmos, other maximum security facilities were placing job postings specifically requesting human guards, because apparently the best way to contain cosmic horrors was to offer them coffee, listen to their problems, and give them something constructive to do with their reality warping abilities. It was, Jake reflected as he headed home to his quarters, exactly the kind of bureaucratic solution that made perfect sense once you stopped overthinking it.